Hello everybody and welcome. My name is Rebeca Mauleon and I'm Director of Education at SF Jazz, in addition to being a musician, author, and educator. And first of all, I would like to thank all of my wonderful musical colleagues, members of CMEA, and a special shout out to Mr. Randy Porter for inviting me to give you this presentation today. This topic on the inclusive syllabus was something that we came across after years really of conversation around inequities in public education and in jazz education in particular. And so I'd like to share with you some of my learning and exploration on this fascinating topic today. So what exactly is an inclusive syllabus? Well, this topic came about as a result of many conversations over the years regarding inequities in music education and jazz education in particular. Certainly there are many parallels to the current climate in our country as well. I, for one, am really excited to share my own learning and exploration of this topic because I think it behooves all of us to constantly be pushing forward and imagining new ways and new forms of teaching. So what does inclusivity look like? Well, first of all, what is our understanding of the systemic inequities that exist in our schools? And how does this manifest itself in the classroom and in the bandroom? Do students see themselves represented in the material? And what about the teachers delivering that material? I think really this begins with upending a lot of our music education standards, and also begins by acknowledging that the systems have been in place for a very long time. We certainly recognize the importance of the social emotional learning piece and how this can be strengthened, enabling our students to see themselves represented not only in the material that we deliver, but also who delivers that material. So I say we commit to upending these so-called standards. First of all, representation matters. It absolutely matters in not only the context of the music history or pedagogy that we're providing, but in who's delivering that material. Also, while we recognize the standards of European aesthetics and those patriarchal systems, we need to decentralize those and understand that there are many other tools in our toolkit. Acknowledging and applying those diverse cultural methodologies will absolutely open up your world of possibilities as a music educator. Centering the student narrative, I think, is important. At SF Jazz, in our education practice, we really understand the aesthetics of the students' generational identity, their cultural identity, and how that helps frame their buy-in into the music. And finally, very simply, intentional selection of the repertoire. What if we look at the standards of aesthetics and looking at all aspects of songwriting and composition and making sure that students are playing music written by people from all over the world? So let's read this together and get to one of the most, I think, valuable frameworks, and that is the importance of the culturally responsive lens. A well-rounded and comprehensive music education taught by highly qualified music educators should be available in all schools and be built upon a curricular framework that provides awareness of, respect for, and responsiveness to the variety and diversity of cultures in their community and the nation at large. I think this is critical, and when we understand culturally responsive teaching, really this research and sort of transforming of education practices is something that we've implemented at SF Jazz. As I mentioned, we have a middle school curriculum. We found this methodology to be invaluable in reframing our own curricular goals. So using this framework, ask yourself the following questions. Is my pedagogy developed collaboratively? Who makes curriculum decisions? Do students have any say? Are my evaluation methods equitable? And is there room for improvement? This book, written by Dr. Geneva Gay, I think is one of the most fascinating studies on culturally responsive teaching practices. And in terms of evaluation methods in particular, understanding that the qualitative data is just as significant as the quantitative data. So I really encourage you to pick up this book. We're going to listen to a little bit of Dr. Gay talking about this research, and in particular why it's important to employ culturally responsive teaching practices in the classroom.
For me, there are several different reasons. One of them, you can categorize these reasons into academic or learning. You can talk about psychological reasons. You can talk about social and political reasons. You can even talk about historical reasons. And I think the underlying message behind all of those is that issues of diversity are always present in our lives, whether they're individual lives or cultural lives or action lives, whatever the actions happen to be. So if that's indeed the case, and if you're talking about the educational enterprise, you want to make that much more effective and successful for students from different cultural frames of reference. And if it is indeed true that the education process is a cultural process too. So that then makes it it's incumbent then for educators at all levels, whether it's elementary, secondary, higher ed, to include cultural responsiveness so that we can, if you will, nuance our curriculum, our instruction, how we interact with students in such a way that we are sensitive to their cultural frames of references.
That is so critical because by truly seeing our students and allowing them to see us, we can really humanize this process. Our interactions with our students are so much more meaningful as a result of this. So think of this sort of jazz education checklist, if you will. It's really like the music itself, this dynamic that normally has been shaped by these patriarchal viewpoints and steeped in this very complicated history of our country. So I think it's important to honor that history and recognize the many hardships and flaws and inequities in our society and, of course, within jazz itself, but understanding that first, by providing context, students can really understand and appreciate the music that much better. Acknowledging the trauma of this music and of our country's history is critical as well. So tell the truth. Don't be afraid to tell the students the truth. And very critical to jazz is centering Black people and experiences in the creation and development of this music. We cannot even begin to explain to a student what jazz is about if we're not centering Black lives in this conversation. And also recognizing and celebrating women as instrumentalists, composers, and band leaders. We don't dismiss the value and the contributions of vocalists. Vocalists are also musicians, but instrumentalists, composers, and band leaders need to be really highlighted and celebrated. So I asked, well, who do you honor? For those of you highlighting jazz repertoire and history, have you thought about exploring many different narratives from gender and race to gender identity that make up this amazing music? And of course, we can extend this definition to jazz and all that connects to and emanates from jazz. So we can include everything from the blues to hip hop. One of the most important and yet really underappreciated artists in jazz music was Mary Lou Williams. Her legacy as a composer, arranger, mentor is unprecedented. It's a wonderful film that came out a few years ago called Mary Lou Williams, The Lady Who Swings the Band. Here's a little bit of that film's trailer.
In Kansas City, there's a pretty gal named Mary Lou, and she plays up.
Mary Lou Williams is one of the greatest composer, arranger, and musicians in jazz history. Duke Ellington's highest form of praise was to say that someone was beyond category. Mary Lou Williams is beyond category.
The history of the music is in everything she writes. The blues is always there. It always swings. You can listen to her and only her and get what jazz is all about.
She's the lady who swings her. She's the lady who swings the band.
Mary Lou was always bucking against what the norm was and trying to expand this notion of what jazz was. She didn't want to be boxed in. She didn't want to be labeled.
Her contribution to this music make her a pioneer, irrespective of gender. But Mary Lou Williams is not well known because she's a woman. Music is so male-controlled that it's very difficult for women instrumentalists to get any respect.
If you want to really see some piano playing, let me know that there's a condition that exists that needs help. Then I'll do something. I'm like a big bear then doing it. I'll just go through all kind of changes to do good.
Such a remarkable contributor to the art form, and again, one who is definitely worth exploring and acknowledging. Extending beyond the more traditional approach to jazz education, my particular work has centered the traditions of the African diaspora in the Caribbean, and I'd like to share a little bit of this with you, in particular because I think it really demonstrates the global aesthetic of jazz. And really, when we talk about the Caribbean connections in jazz history, they're undeniable, right? The Antilles have this richness and diversity, and certainly a very similar post-colonial trauma to what we've experienced in the United States. But all of these islands have played a very vital role in shaping music in the United States. And over the years, I've been studying, again, primarily the music of the African diaspora in Cuba and Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Trinidad, Jamaica, etc. And I just want to highlight a couple of these traditions just to kind of give you a framework and a sense of why it's also important to go beyond these sort of Western European aesthetics. One of the most remarkable traditions is the bomba from Puerto Rico. A lot of our work in SF Jazz Education centers a lot of these traditions from the Caribbean, really framing music as a form of cultural resistance. Yes, it's important to recognize and celebrate the music as a form of cultural identity, but resistance and liberation are two elements that students, in particular in middle and high school, are really keenly aware of. So I want to share with you a couple of these videos that really highlight some of these amazing traditions.
Estamos bailando en tres áreas que son el corazón de la bomba en el norte: San Juan, Santurce y Loíza. Es una manera de bailar bien libre. Tú haces lo que en el momento tú sientas, lo que en el momento tú te nazcan hacer. Me ha llevado a quererme, a respetarme, a valorarme. La bomba viene de África, ¿no? De nuestros ancestros los africanos.
Me siento honrada porque yo siento que yo estoy representando a mis antepasados, ¿entiendes? A mis ancestros. O sea, esa era la única forma de ellos expresarse.
Un instrumento, un espacio para rebeliones, ¿verdad? Sirvió. Antisistémica, antirracista, anti todas esas opresiones que significaba ese sistema esclavista que había en esa época. Hoy en día, la música sigue siendo un espacio de libertad y sigue siendo un espacio político de transformación. A bailar.
And what a remarkable transformation, and particularly when you see young people being drawn into these traditions, understanding the deep roots and the connections and the generational inclusivity, the fact that everyone participates in these traditions and everyone passes them on because they are intrinsically oral traditions. I think another way to foster inclusivity is to shine a light on the artists who have overcome incredible obstacles, discrimination, exclusion, and these various traditions that were very male-dominated for decades. One of these artists that I love to highlight is Calypso Rose from Trinidad and Tobago. Calypso, of course, Calypso Rose was one of the most winning Calypso queens in the history of Calypso, and yet in the early decades of the art form meant it was very male-centered and it was very difficult for women to even have a place. And she had to fight and fight practically her entire life to stand toe-to-toe with her male colleagues. There was a fabulous film made in 2004 called Calypso Dreams, where they interviewed several different Calypsonians, including Calypso Rose, and she she offers a little quote from one of her very famous songs.
I am like a river overflowing its bank. You try to stop me, I'm going to find room to pass.
And so this was something that I think many Calypsonians resisted for many years, was the idea that, a woman could have the same level of discourse, the same level of humor and irony and frustration. And these are all the topics that you would hear included in Calypso songs. Calypso Rose has been, again, a stalwart of this art form. She turned 80 years old this year and still going strong. This is a recent music video of her, Calypso Queen.
They say that I reign too long, forgetting that my constitution is strong. Instead of was small, they could stand up tall and strong like a wrecking ball. I would knock them down. They say that I reign too long, forgetting that the Constitution is strong. Instead of respecting me long, long reign, they making plot to take dominion.
And she, again, has retained more of these titles of Queen of Calypso than any other artist. And it's true that when young girls get to see themselves represented on stage, then they're more likely to engage in that particular art form. Jazz education, even in higher ed, has also been bound by this very sort of male-centered dynamic. But there's a bold new program established at Berklee College of Music in Boston, founded by the incredible Terry Lynn Carrington, who is the artistic director of the Jazz and Gender Justice Institute at Berklee. She is, of course, a celebrated drummer, Grammy-winning composer, producer, and here she is talking a little bit about this new way forward.
Jazz has been such a patriarchal community from the beginning that it's hard for people to see it any other way. But what would the music sound like if many of the contributors were women?
Because the music itself is gendered, the music has never been allowed to reach its own potential.
Some people would say, well, there just weren't enough women around. But what we have to look at is the machinery, social, economic, political, that didn't allow those voices to flourish.
The jazz industry, which has been predominantly male, has echoed the bias system from which it emerged. So what would jazz sound like in a culture without patriarchy?
Justice is indivisible, as Dr. King said. Racial justice and gender justice are linked.
Berklee has been a very supportive environment to female instrumentalists for a long time, from Toshiko Akiyoshi to Esperanza Spalding. So it makes sense that Berklee would be in the forefront of gender equity with jazz and other genres.
What would jazz sound like, performed without bias, without patriarchy, is not a question where we should answer it by coming up with words to tell us what it should sound like. It's precisely the work the music will do. But we have to make it possible for that music to get made.
We started Berklee Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice to address these issues and to create a safe and nurturing environment for people of all gender identification to study jazz.
Jazz really has played a major role in transformations.
This is a beautiful start to making the music even more radical, inclusive, and to make it a space for justice.
And such powerful words. If you think about jazz as the ultimate expression of democracy, this is exactly what we're striving for, and that transformation is possible. So let's think about what actions we can take. We need to commit to actions that are going to transform our teaching practices, and we must recognize that this is not going to happen overnight. So it begins with developing a culturally responsive framework, really understanding those methodologies and how you practice in the classroom and in the band room. Committing to introducing diverse repertoire, rethinking and reframing your pedagogy, again, upending those standards, making sure that you're inclusive of different worldviews and perspectives. Cultivate an inclusive community to ensure representation. Remember, the students need to see themselves reflected not only in the content, but in who delivers that content. And as far as those of you music educators, it's time to take a leap and a plunge into uncharted territory. Take on something new. Try something you haven't done before. We have this wonderful capacity to learn, this neuroplasticity in our brains. Let's make sure that you're really walking that walk. And finally, we've provided a PDF deck of these slides with some live links to wonderful, valuable articles, some blog posts, and also a link to that book that I mentioned, that reference by Dr. Geneva Gay on culturally responsive teaching. So I want to make sure that you have time to not only research these, but also seek out sheet music composed and arranged by women. Be intentional in your practices and making sure that you're centering the student and you're really acknowledging the inclusivity, the opportunity of inclusion in this art form. Thank you so much once again for joining me on this journey and for stepping into some new and uncharted territory. I think together we can all work to truly transform jazz education, and that begins with all of us sitting together and having conversations. This is amazing work, and it's well worth it for our students. So once again, thank you so much for your attention, and please take good care.